Hey there, cats and kittens. Welcome to BTD. My name's Mark. Today, we're talking about campaign prep. And specifically, we're talking about campaign prep for pre-generated adventures. So you went out to your local game store, you bought the book, you brought it home, you got it in front of you. Now what do? Let's get into it. So I just finished my series of talking through the different adventures that Wizards has come out with in 5th edition. So I think it's a really good time to talk about campaign prep when you have these established adventures. So you figured out which of the adventures you want to run, you've got the book in front of you, and you're ready to get started. What do you need to do? Well, the first thing that I do, and that I would recommend you do, is just read it cover to cover. Read the book, and don't take notes at this point. You're just reading it to get a sense of everything that's inside of it. And I would also then, once you're finished reading it, I would just sort of let it sit for at least a few days and let that sort of digest in your system. Let it percolate inside your mind to think through the different possibilities of this adventure. And at the end of those few days, you probably have a sense of what is most exciting to you. Maybe it's the aspects of the adventure that you've been thinking about the most, that you've been running through your head again and again. So I would, on this first run through, not take any notes, but I'm trying to figure out what is most exciting to me about this adventure. So once you find that, the coolest elements of this adventure that you think you're going to be able to bring to life in the most interesting way, that's going to be your focus. Maybe not your only focus, but it is going to be a big part of the focus when you're prepping this adventure. The next thing I would do is read through it again. And it doesn't necessarily have to be word for word, line for line, but you are going through the entire book in chronological order. And it's at this point that I'm probably taking notes. Now, these aren't notes that I'm going to take with me into the first session. These are notes for planning how I'm going to do that, how I'm going to get to that first session. And so I'm creating a lot of mental maps of how the different NPCs or plot hooks or areas of the campaign, maybe it's locations, how they all link together and how I will want to structure the campaign. And I'm probably slowing down when I get to those elements that earlier on my first read through really excited me. And I'm figuring out exactly how I want to bring them to life and what other elements I might be able to pull in to these things so that if it is something that excites me, I'm making it as big a deal as possible in the adventure. So you might expand this from something that would last maybe a session or two if you run it as written to something that takes up a larger chunk of the campaign if it is a story beat or an area or an entire chapter that you think is really cool. So I'm probably also writing down major NPCs, major plot hooks, how those link together, and I'm basically creating a diagram of how everything flows together. And a lot of the adventures do this for you. They'll have some sort of flow chart, and it shows, A to B or A to one of these three and then one of these two, however it works. They will sometimes have these sorts of flow charts, but I'm creating my own because I find a lot of times the ones that are created for the adventures aren't as detailed as they need to be to really figure out how everything is locked together and working together. The other thing that I'm looking for on this second read through are any elements, whether it's plot hooks or events, where it has to happen in a very particular way, and if it doesn't, the story can't move forward. This is where you get these bottlenecks, and this is where there is a danger that you're going to have to railroad the players into it because there aren't other ways through this portion of the story or to figure out who the villain is or how to get the magic item, whatever it is. And if I see something where it's you need to do it this way or else, I'm trying to find at least one more route to get to that place, to circumvent the bottleneck, so that if my players don't end up doing that, I don't have to railroad them into it. Ideally, you create a few different ways. So that might be as simple as making notes of, all right, this NPC that they met earlier has this piece of information. And maybe it doesn't say they have that piece of information in the adventure, but you're adding it in so that they have another person they can talk to who can give them information that'll lead them to this place so that they don't have to get bottlenecked or railroaded into one particular path. I'm also figuring out if it is essentially linear, if it's a sandbox, if there are elements of both of those things. So where are the choke points where, like, all right, once this happens, then they enter this area that's a sandbox, and then these things happen in some order, and then this happens and you move along. So you're figuring out what points of the adventure are open-ended and which are a little bit more linear. Now, I said earlier, if you see something where this has to happen or else, you probably want to find another way around it. And that's absolutely true, but I don't think linear itself is a bad thing at certain points. So once you enter a dungeon, most dungeons are linear. And some story arcs at times are going to be a little bit linear, but I'm identifying those places that are a little bit more open-ended. So if I want to pull in other things, if I want to stop for a bit and pull in things from my characters' backstories, if I want to add some side quests that maybe aren't written in the main adventure, this is where I'm doing that. And the last thing that I'm looking for, in addition to what is most exciting to me, what are the coolest elements, is I'm looking and I'm seeing what isn't cool, what isn't needed, what seems like fluff, what seems like filler, what can I remove without meaningfully changing the adventure. And I think that at least knowing where you can cut material is good. You don't necessarily have to cut it, but knowing that you can is important, because maybe you want to, at a certain point in the adventure, you realize, all right, this has been going on for long enough. I don't think my players are going to be interested in continuing it for too much longer. Let me get them to what I think is the more exciting stuff. So knowing what you can cut, how you can cut it, is important. And I think at times you're going to be expanding the stuff that's cool to you and either limiting or completely eliminating the stuff that either isn't necessary or isn't as cool. And this can include things like side quests where you say, all right, this seems like a dud, I want to do this instead. And you create a side quest from whole cloth that replaces one of the ones that's in the adventure. So especially in these more open-ended sections, or if it's a campaign that is very open-ended as a whole, say it's a full sandbox campaign, don't worry too much about the order of events. As long as you're not throwing your players at level 2 into an encounter created for level 10, in what order they do certain things doesn't necessarily matter. And if you do have these side quests and little sandbox areas for your players, then it's good to have a sense of what are the main plot hooks, what are the main plot quests that are going to move it from one section to the next. There might be side quests that don't necessarily move the plot forward in the same way, and so it's good to have a couple different ways to hook your players into the same main plot quests so that they don't ever get stuck. So I think most times players have a pretty good sense of where the main plot is. This isn't a problem too often, but depending on how nebulous certain sections of the campaign are, it can be difficult to realize what is and isn't going to move things forward. So some examples of a few of these. In Out of the Abyss, I know a lot of people have traditionally either removed or merged a lot of the NPCs that are available to use in the first chapter that are fellow prisoners of the Drow, because there are just too many of them to bring them all to life in a believable way, at least for many DMs. So they'll either eliminate some of the NPCs altogether, they won't have them in the adventure, and they'll find ways to incorporate that information into other plot hooks or other NPCs, or they'll find ways to offload those NPCs very quickly so that the focus never leaves the players. Or, for example, when I was prepping Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and we did a full video on this, one of the things that I noted was that there are a lot of side quests in one of the chapters that aren't necessarily too fleshed out. And this is purposeful. They give you a lot of potential plot hooks for different factions that don't necessarily have a whole lot to them. It might just be 2 or 3 sentences, and then you as the DM have to run with that. So do you make that a few dice rolls, or do you turn it into an entire session? But either way, I think there were some that caught my interest more than others. So if my players went down a particular faction quest chain in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, I would probably look at that quest chain and say, okay, which ones to me are the most interesting? Which ones do I think are kind of duds? And if this one's a dud, what can I insert instead that I think will be more interesting? So I actually have, as I'm recording this and getting ready to run Waterdeep Dragon Heist, I have a couple side quests in the wings to pull in if needed that I think are very interesting, and I think will be more interesting than some of what's in the book. And it'll still be related to the same goals. It'll still be to gain favor with a particular NPC or faction, and then that will then hopefully give them an ally or a faction contact that they can leverage into advantages later on in the plot, in the main plot. But this itself is sort of a side quest, so it's achieving the same end. It's just inserting something that I think is going to be a little bit cooler. So once you've made all of your edits like this, and you have the things that you want to really bring out, and you have the things that you want to minimize as much as possible, and you know the connections between the NPCs and the plot hooks, and you've eliminated the fluff that you don't think is going to be needed or that you think will take the spotlight off of your players, you've got all of these things rattling around in your brain, that's when it's time to turn it into session notes. So you go back to the beginning, you see your notes, and then you start to just list out bullet points of things that you want to remember during play, and you're prepping maybe 1 or 2 sessions out in advance. Or if it's a sandbox, what I would probably do is wherever location the PCs are at, I would prep 1 session out in a few different likely directions. So it's going to be a little bit more prep, but they are going to only choose one of those. And eventually over the course of the campaign, there will be less of that prep for you to do. And I would just take it a step at a time, knowing what's coming, but not necessarily prepping too hard in advance, because your players are going to change what you expect to happen in the game. And to what extent you use the book during play is really up to you. I know that some people will just have their notes after having read through the book a couple times, and then if they come up with something at the table based on their notes or just on the fly that isn't in the book, then they just run with it. They roll with it, they make it work. Whereas others want to run it more as written, and so they'll have the book open right there, and they'll have a lot of the flavor text and NPC stuff right there in front of them, so that everything that they're saying is coming from the written material. I think that there's no right or wrong answer to that, but it's important to know which one of those two you're going to do so that you can have the proper resources in front of you. In our adventure series, talking about the 5th edition adventures from Wizards, we talked about hacking certain adventures, meaning like chopping it up into different parts and then taking the parts that you want and inserting them into a different campaign. So you're not actually running the full adventure when you do this. And while it's not quite the same as that, I think that with pre-gen adventures, there are 2 overarching ways you can look at it. And it relates a little bit to the same thing of whether or not a DM just goes from their notes or whether they're actually reading from the book a lot of times. And I know that some DMs will buy a pre-gen adventure and they're running it, but they're running it in a very loose sense, in that when they read through it the first, the second time, they make their notes, they're thinking of the adventure as a buffet. So it's basically a handful of plots and ideas and NPCs, and they can pull what they need into their game and make it their own. So they're not necessarily pulling it into a different campaign. They are running the adventure, but it's going to be a lot more loose. It's going to be a lot more different than someone running it exactly as written. There's another style of DMing that will read all of the out loud text and will stick very closely to what's written, because they don't want to go off the written rails, because then it can start to get into territory where things start to lose their coherence, or you lose certain plot hooks, and if you come up with something on the fly that doesn't make sense, then you have to find a way to incorporate it. So it can be a lot of work if you're not used to running a game that way. So for some, it's much easier to stick to the written text and not change that much. But again, no right or wrong answers. I think I prefer to run it more buffet style, to use my own terminology here. And most of the adventures that I've run have either just been hacked up and pulled out of these adventures to incorporate into my own campaigns in certain ways, or, and this is definitely how I'm going to be running Dragon Heist, is it will be Dragon Heist in every sense of the word, but there's going to be a lot of homebrewed elements so that I make it my own. And I'm probably not going to have the book open too often. I'll have a good enough understanding of the plot elements that anything else that comes up at the table that I'm not necessarily expecting, I'll just make up. And if that scares the hell out of you and you don't want to do that, please don't. But I think that both are valid ways of handling it. And the prep for both styles is going to be somewhat similar. I think I would approach it the same way regardless. But then once you're actually running it at the table, you can see a lot of variance between one DM and the next and one play group and the next, depending on how loosely they want to interpret the written material. And I think this approach is very universal in that, say you have an adventure you love from 4th edition, and of course all of the encounters are going to be off because you can't run the same things in 5th edition. You know, certain monsters and encounters might be too challenging, others might not be challenging enough. There's going to be a lot of mechanical issues with taking it from one to the other. But everything that we talked about today is pretty abstract. so that your process of going through and taking these notes is more about the narrative beats. It's more about the NPCs and the hooks, and that's going to be universal to any edition of play. And then, yes, you will have to do some extra work if you're, say, changing encounters or changing enemy types from one edition to the next, but it doesn't require actual conversions so much as just taking what you need, buffet style perhaps, from these past adventures and then turning it into 5th edition by generating your own encounters that are going to be balanced. So I think a method of prep that accentuates these connections in the narrative structure of the story is going to be a little bit easier to pull in and out of different editions without giving yourself a whole heck of a lot of work worrying about those fiddly bits if, say, there is something from 4th edition that you really want to run except that everything is off mathematically. So that's it for campaign prep for pre-established adventures. Down in the comments, let me know what's your favorite adventure, either in 5th edition or in D&D in general. I would love to hear it. I certainly have my opinions about which ones I like and don't like as much. I'm not sure I have a favorite. I'd probably have to think about that, but I would love to hear yours. And until the next video, take care.